Hello, my friends. Let's find out what happens in Chapter 6 of Mr. Penguin and the Lost Treasure. Chapter 6. We need to find an X. Well, here we are, said Miss Bones, gesturing to a table full of objects in her office. It had obviously been a very nice room once, quite a fancy affair with neat bookshelves and little lace doilies on all the side tables. Now, like the rest of the museum, it was falling apart. Books were stacked up in huge piles, most of the shelves were hanging off the walls, and the lace doilies looked like they had been rummaged through at a particularly energetic yard sale. Mr. Penguin clambered up a handy pile of books so he could get a proper look at everything on the table. Colin threw out a length of cobweb, twirled it above his head like a lasso, and used it to climb up behind his friend. These, continued Miss Bones, are the clues we found already. Montague and I have spent the last day or so hunting by ourselves, haven't we, Monty? Monty grunted and nodded his head, obviously the strong, silent type, a bit like Colin, thought Mr. Penguin. We started here, said Miss Bones, pointing to a book called A History of the Museum of Extraordinary Objects. It was written ages ago by some relative of mine, and it mentions the buried treasure. Most people, including myself, thought it was all just a story, but I did a bit more research and discovered that there could be something to it. A scroll tucked away in a hidden drawer on my desk here led us to a carved saber-tooth ostrich tusk in one of the second-floor galleries. Which in turn sent us to look at that stuffed walrus I mentioned earlier on the phone. We found a little word search puzzle tucked away in his armpit just before the toilet fell through the roof. Rather lucky, really. As she talked, Mr. Penguin listened carefully and stroked his beak with a flipper in what he hoped looked like a clever and very thoughtful gesture. Montague was no help at all with the word search puzzle, but I did it quite quickly. It gave us the clue, X marks the spot. But to tell you the truth, we are now stumped. We've looked for crosses here, there, and everywhere, even behind the family portraits and under the trees in the courtyard. Mr. Penguin cast an eye out of a nearby window and gasped. Awful as it was, said Miss Bones, fussing with her blouse. The storm last week that ripped them all out of the ground did us a favor. I mean, Monty could look for clues all around them, roots and all. He's going to plant them all back this weekend, aren't you, dear? Monty hadn't really been listening. He'd been picking at a fingernail, but hearing his name made him jump and nod his head vigorously. Miss Bones beamed at Mr. Penguin and blinked expectantly behind her spectacles. You'll be able to find X, won't you? She asked. But Mr. Penguin didn't have a clue. He flipped through A History of the Museum of Extraordinary Objects and found an illustrated map at the back. I suggest, he said, playing for time, that we start our hunt at the very top of the museum and don't stop until we've found it. We could split up into two groups to be quicker. Mr. Penguin was hoping he might be able to slip off somewhere to have a sneaky bite of his fish finger sandwich. It was past lunchtime now, and his stomach was telling him so rather loudly. Excellent, Miss Bones said, but I'd rather we all stick together. Mr. Penguin's stomach groaned, but he disguised the sound by whooping loudly and enthusiastically, and they all set off. Colin leapt expertly from Mr. Penguin's shoulder and did a survival roll across the floor tiles. Just as he was about to follow everyone down the corridor, he stopped. He heard something. What was it? It sounded like hammering or a distant thumping somewhere, as if someone was outside and knocking at a heavy door to come in. Colin cocked his head to listen more carefully, but as he did, the knocking noise stopped. He reached under his bowler hat, pulled out his pad and pen, and wrote, and he underlined it very importantly. For the next 20 minutes, they hunted high and low. They looked down all the chimneys and in all the air vents. They searched around some stone statues and inspected tribal masks. They looked inside huge painted vases and behind boxes of souvenir postcards in the store cupboard. On the ground floor, in a room devoted to interesting and unusual tea and coffee pots, Colin heard the strange clonking noise again. He tapped Mr. Penguin on the kneecap and held up his little notebook. "Psst," it said. Mr. Penguin looked around. Miss Bones and Montague were removing a large teapot from the wall and were quite distracted. "Yes?" he hissed. Colin flipped over the page on his notebook. "Can you hear that banging noise?" Mr. Penguin cocked his head and listened. There was indeed an odd banging sort of noise coming from somewhere. "I don't like it," said Colin's pad. "I think someone is trying to break in." Mr. Penguin listened again. The banging stopped. "Don't be silly," he said. "Who would want to break in? The front door has that big close sign on it, so everybody knows the museum isn't open. It's probably the pipes. Old buildings, like this, always have noisy, clonky pipes." Colin wasn't convinced, but before he could scribble anything else, Miss Bones sighed loudly and said, "Nothing in here. Let's carry on, although we do seem to be running out of places." Colin popped his pad away, and the 4 treasure hunters continued their search. 15 minutes later, they were back in the entrance hall, and everyone sagged and looked depressed. "No X anywhere," huffed Miss Bones, pursing her lips. Mr. Penguin scratched his head. "If we were on a desert island looking for pirate treasure," he said, half to himself, "there would be a great big X on the floor for us to find. But there isn't one here at—" He stopped. Just a minute, he thought. What if there was an X on the floor of the museum and it had been there all along and none of them had noticed it? He opened the book and scoured the map again before tapping it joyfully with a flipper. "There is an X," he cried. "Look!" He pointed to the part of the map showing the circular entrance hall. There was the dinosaur skeleton in the middle, and all the way around the edge of the room was the word, "The Museum of Extraordinary Objects," had been carved into the floor. "And," cried Mr. Penguin, "the word extraordinary has an X in it." Everyone gasped. "What if," continued Mr. Penguin, "that X is where the treasure is hidden? Let's go have a look." But the 4 treasure hunters didn't have far to go at all. As luck would have it, Mr. Penguin was, right at the very moment, standing directly on top of the enormous X, the X that possibly marked the spot. See what happens in Chapter 7 next time.